So I'm here with another Windsor boy, fellow podcaster, a chiropractor, and also a powerlifter. He's the founder of Prescript and RX'D radio podcast, an online coach known as the Muscle Doc, Dr. Jordan Shallow. Welcome to WinCity Sports, man.
What's happening, man? Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, dude. Like I said, we're gonna get to know you a little bit through this interview. Briefly, kind of talking about it, but where were you kind of growing up? What area of city are you from? What schools did you go to? All that kind of basic stuff.
Yeah, so I moved to Windsor when I was very young, like 4 or 5. Lived in Riverside my whole life, pretty much. So like right by the high school. Went to Heatherington grade school, went to Riverside High School, did a few years at the University of Windsor before I went up to Toronto and then out to the States. And parents are still there, same house I grew up in. So now that I'm back in Canada, like just going back to the old neighborhood, it's pretty nostalgic. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny. It's such a small place because we're everywhere, man. Like Windsor people, you'll be in the most random corner of the world, and you'll be like, "Wait a minute, I remember you."
Yeah, man. That's one thing we talk about with a lot of people too. And then that's the fun of doing the show is just finding people that maybe I never heard of or that I didn't know were from Windsor and telling their stories, getting to know them and talk the same kind of shit that we are right now, Like you said, just it's a small place, but it's a big place. Everyone knows each other and everyone doesn't know each other. Windsor's a crazy place.
Yeah, I think so. There's a certain pride that people from Windsor have that I'd like. I haven't seen and expressed from any other city. I've seen people interact with each other in different places outside of their home, like literally all over the world, and at nowhere do you find an immediate connection between two people, like a shared experience, like people that grew up in Windsor.
Yeah, dude. And that's when like it comes into play here a lot talking to athletes where it's like, well, if you got to cross paths with another Windsor guy, I'm sure that was like a cool thing for you, right? Or like a relieving thing. Like even for me when I moved to Sarnia for a bit, if I met someone from Windsor, I was like, oh fuck, all right, cool, Windsor, someone from Windsor, and that just it's exactly what you're saying, right?
Yeah, there's just I don't know. No, regardless, it's funny. My buddy Killian from Windsor, my producer for my podcast, I went to high school with. He's here in Toronto, and it's just like there's just an understanding. Like there's what's the best because the high isn't super high, the low is not super low, and at the end of the day, everyone just drives a Dodge Ram. Like you make 400K, you make 40K, like everyone just drives a Ford or something, and like I don't know, it's a cool it's like a leveling ground, like it's a common table that everyone sits at. So like you go other places like there's pecking orders and it's clicky and there's elitists and there's all this where it's like no one's trying to pretend there's something they're not when they're from Windsor.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're seeing it out there too. It's not like saying I'm from Toronto and you're from Toronto too. You know what I mean? It's like if you're from Windsor, it's like, oh, again, where did you go to school? What area did you grow up in? People start asking those kind of questions. If two Toronto guys are like, yeah, so what, right?
Yeah, Toronto is too big to have that like degree of separation,
Of course.
and there's just not that shared experience. Like there's too much breadth in the potential experience where you're gonna grow up in Tecumseh and you're like okay maybe these things were a certain way, but the west end of Tecumseh to Highway 3, it's a pretty uniform experience. So like you're gonna get your ass handed to you downtown. You're gonna get punched in the head. You definitely regard rich or poor, people don't give a shit. Like there's a certain everyone's kind of walked in the same shoes. Like the second you get, and it's funny because it's the most, and I drive it now to see mom and dad all the time. But the second you get south of Chatham, it's the most boring drive, but I'm never more excited. And then
Yeah.
you just get on the other side, you hit that Tilbury exit, and you're like, oh man, it's like
Yeah.
Manning Road is coming up, and you're just like, yes. But
No,
yeah,
I
there's
know.
no
I was
question,
to
man.
say that too. Like as soon as I hit like the Essex sign, I'm like, all right, here we go. Finally, we're getting there.
Right.
It's the same thing, right? But it's funny that you kind of touched upon some things that I obviously will talk about, and that I always think about too is that Windsor toughness too is something we always talk about with people. Again, talking to a lot of athletes on this podcast, so kind of talking about it before we got started. But you played some hockey. I'm sure you played all kinds of sports growing up before you started, like really getting into the weights and all that other kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, minor hockey was kind of my big focus. I swam a bit in high school. I did some track and field. I played soccer. You just honestly, it's something that when I talk to Windsor athletes, it's their parents are just trying to keep them out of drugs. Like that's really all it is. It's like, what do we got? Pickleball? Is it on Friday night? Yeah, sure. Put them in pickleball. Like, just keep them away from drugs. But it's a scrappy town, man. Like you don't realize it because everyone's like, I wasn't necessarily like a tough kid or anything like that. I didn't think because I knew tough kids. Like
Hmm.
I was, you get beat up. I was a bouncer downtown, and like, there'd be some guys like, yo, if he fucking die, I know about this guy. Like, I'm out. If he fires off, I'm leaving out the back
Hmm.
door. And but you take that anywhere else, and you're just like, and that's the thing in comparing it to Toronto. It's like it's small enough to have that degree of separation where everyone kind of knows everyone, but it's also big enough and exposed enough where you can get big city trouble like in a real small radius. Like, you want to find trouble in Windsor. Like you're not hard pressed to find it. Like so that where some smaller towns where everyone knows everyone, they're relatively sheltered. Where it's like you're not sheltered in Windsor. You grew up watching Channel 7, Channel 4 news. Like you read about, kids getting shot, 8 kids dead before you even fucking had your bowl of cereal in the morning. So it's a weird contrast of like most insular communities that have that cohesiveness, that connectivity, um, that degree of separation or lack thereof, also have seemingly a separation from the insensitivities of like the real world. And Windsor has all of the good and I don't want to say all of the bad because it's a lot of what like I think allows. And obviously this is like speaking at a much broader sense, and I don't want to like put words in anyone's mouth, but like I think it allows people to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations, like be grateful for things that they have. Like how many of our friends like parents lost their jobs in '08, right? You just get used to like shit going wrong sometimes, and it's just when stuff goes right you're stoked, and then if it goes wrong you're like, oh well, yeah, this isn't as bad as that one time.
Hmm.
It's the single most, I would say, like outside of like my parents, obviously, but it's the single most impactful thing on me as a person as growing up in Windsor.
Just where you're from, it's who you are, kind of thing. And it kind of alludes to what you were talking about before too. Again, when you meet somebody from Windsor elsewhere, those kind of things pop into your mind, and that person understands.
Yeah, like my one of my closest friends, I met him a few years ago, and it wasn't for probably 3 or 4 months that I even realized that he was from Windsor.
Oh
And then
yeah.
I'm like, of course. And it's just like, like loyalty, respect. These are things that like if shit popped off, I know this kid would
Yeah.
100% have my back, and like
Yeah.
that's just something that you like. It's team colors, man. Like it's just, and in most city, like if you're in a fight and you're from Toronto and some other guy knows you're from Toronto, that other guy from Toronto is just gonna leave. Where like someone from Windsor, like, no, that guy went to Brennan. I got him.
Yeah,
Like
even if you
it's
don't
just
want to, it's just like,
right.
fuck, you got
Yeah.
to do it. But like, is a guy from home, right? So you got to
Yeah.
have everyone's got each other's
It's
back.
it's a tribe, man, for sure.
Yeah, it's cool, man. But that again, that's why I love doing this. And to again, it's a sports podcast. So you talked about you played a lot of hockey growing up, and probably other stuff just recreationally, whatever. But when did you kind of start getting into like lifting weights and kind of getting? Obviously, you have like a passion for that kind of stuff. Obviously, being a coach and stuff. So like, where did it kind of start? Or did you just want to do it just to do it, or was it for any specific reason?
Yeah, I mean, from the age of like 7, I got on the ice playing hockey, and that was really like that was it. Like that's all I did. I was a goalie. I had goalie magazines. I knew all the stats of all the players. I watched every game. Like I played year round in summer leagues. I went to goalie camps. I would go to the States. I would go up to Toronto. Like it was kind of all in. And then you get to an age where you start to realize what's differentiating like the good players from like the great players. Like, your age out of like the AA system and played or the
Mm-hmm.
single A system, and it's like, well, what's next? And you're 17, 18 years old, you end up like bantam and midget, and then it's like, well, you either go to juniors or you stop playing, or you go to Forest Gate Arena at like midnight every Thursday, or go bug Butch Ott to see if you can get on his team down at Ice Park or something. And it's like, well, or you can play juniors. So it's like, well, okay, like how do I do that? And then someone was like, well, you should probably do like off ice conditioning and like start working out. So I started working out just to get better at hockey. It was like 15, 16 years old, and it's like, the writing's on the wall. You only got a few years left, and if you want to make a run at being playing junior C or junior B or whatever, and just kind of edge out your career a little bit longer, like this is what you did. So I got in the gym to just get better at hockey, believe it or not. And I liked, so I was a goalie kind of a majority of my hockey career. And, goalies are it's a very unforgiving position where it's, you can be, you can have a good day and it still be a bad day. So I think weight training kind of got me where I was directly in control of the result, right? There was like, if I put in the effort and if I put in, the time, and I monitored my nutrition, I did all that, like I would be a direct beneficiary from the effort I put in, where it's like, you can practice and you can run your ass off and you can do all the drills, and then, you can end up like, fuck, dude, I grew up playing against like the Wellwoods, man. Like I remember with like almost a mercy rule. Like the entire Tecumseh team was just one of the Wellwood brothers. And like he scored like 9 goals on me one game. I'm like, this is bullshit. But I could go to the gym and I could do a bunch of bench press, and then my bench press gets stronger. I was like, oh, I like the control here. Like I like that I can kind of master this domain, and I can be, the efforts I put in. And for years, like you'd put in, like, you practice 7 days a week, like you just lived on the ice. My undershirt I wore under my equipment was never dry. It was just, I bought it and I wore it, and it was just continue. I would put it on a rack or something in the back, but I'd have it on again before it could ever get dry for like a decade, like for like 15 years of my life. But with the gym, it was like, oh, okay, like I can be in direct control over this. And if I put that same effort into something, and it almost taught me to like work harder, because like I need to be in a situation where not only I can control my performance, but I might have to compensate for someone else who can't perform up to their level, right? So it's like, what if I have a defender? What if we're shorthanded? It's like, you try and carry as much of the load as you can, and then you take that almost like super compensatory mindset into something that doesn't even really necessitate it. Then all of a sudden it's like, wow, like you can start to see things exponential. And then once I started to see that, it was, I played a few years in Kingsville, when they still had a junior C team. We come to understand now they don't have it anymore. And then by the end of it, I was with lifting weights was really at the forefront of my mind, and hockey was the formality. So, kind of very easy transition for me to walk away from the ice and just to start to continue on into weight training. And then it wasn't until 2015. No, is that right? Yeah, 2015, 2016, I did my first powerlifting meet when I was in California, and I had a pretty strong base, and I landed in a pretty cool gym at the time with some top like world-class lifters, and I really had an accelerated start getting into the sport, and was able to kind of take to it pretty quickly.
Well, that's cool, man. I mean, pretty seamless and easy transition, I guess you can say the word transition, kind of, because like you said, like you're put into sports as a kid just because your parents just want you to do it, and that's all all is hockey. You didn't really know that there's other kind of things out there like that. So once you get older and you start to discover these kind of things, that's when you discover your passions too, right?
Yeah, it was like hockey definitely taught me a lot, but it was that transition was basically went from hockey to weight training to school. And then when I finished school, it was almost like that was like another transitory state of like, you're not really a student when you're in high school. Like for me, it was just like sports. And then getting into grad school, and I moved to California, it was like, I was kind of, I think, punching above my academic capacity. I was like, oh, why am I in a grad school program? Like, this is ridiculous. So I really changed my vocation from, I would still work out all the time, and that never changed. But like, I definitely identified as a student. So I was like an athlete forever. And then it was like a transition into student. And then when I graduated, it was like, I don't want to identify as like a chiropractor. Like that always seemed lame to me. So I wanted to, because in school it can be competitive, in sport it can be competitive, and I didn't have an outlet to compete anymore. So then I was just working out one day, and some guy was like, well, you're pretty strong for your size, and maybe if you ever considered powerlifting. So I just kind of gave it a shot, and thinking like, again, all my training partners were literally world record holders. So I entered this meet in Santa Cruz, California, and like I thought I was just going to get the shit kicked out of me. because every day I go to the gym and like all of my training partners are way stronger, but realizing that they were the strongest guys in the world. And then I showed up to my first meet and I did quite well. And it was like, oh, okay, like I'm basing this off of world class. And then I just kind of kept at it for the last like 5 or 6 years.
So like obviously you were familiar with the sport through like the guys you were training with, but like prior to that, did you ever like hear of powerlifting, ever interest you, anything like that?
It's funny, the only person I had ever heard of was a Windsor guy, was Kelly.
Kelly,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
It
I've had
was
him a
Kelly
long time
Brand.
ago.
Yeah, so like I knew Kelly, and also oddly enough, like I knew of Kelly and what he was doing, and then there's like the Windsor fitness world that I kind of like fit into a little bit now. It's like, Fuad and his podcast, and Kelly and him and the downtown crew of bouncers that gets like mixed in there, and
Yeah.
Central Good Life when that was still good, or
Yeah, that's
lifestyles, and that was still,
I train at Central actually.
yeah. So like
Still to
all of
this
those
day.
dudes.
Yeah.
Plus, when I was in California, the only other guy I had heard of who was doing powerlifting was this guy named Dan Green, who was this world record holder, very famous in the sport, and that was who ended up being my training partner. Um, so the only exposure I really had was, just hearing from Kelly through the grapevine after I left Canada and what he was doing uh, in powerlifting back home and on the world stage, and then this guy Dan, who ended up just being like, by pure luck, ended up being my training partner and who actually signed me up for my first meet. But other than that, I was like, people compete at this? Like
Yeah,
that's kind of, I
yeah.
had no idea how it worked, like commands and weigh-ins and all this and weight classes, and I don't know, whatever. I just lifted weights.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not like something you see on TV every day or or whatever, right? So
Right. Yeah. It's pretty fringe. I mean, social media has definitely driven its popularity and increased the number of eyeballs on it, but it's not like you're turning on to TSN and seeing highlights of the last meet, right?
and it makes you want to kind of do it, right? But you talk about like all the schooling you've been to, and obviously I went to California. So like right after like high school, at that time, obviously you're playing, and that's where you start to get into the weights. So did you decide like I want to do something with this? I want to go for like kinesiology, or like what's the story there?
Yeah, so believe it or not, I studied 2 years at Windsor studying history and political science. I was always in my mind I was just going to be a history professor. I, I like I like the subject matter. It's still something that I read a lot, like to this day, like World War One, World War Two, like North American, European history. Um, but it was just the people, man. Like it wasn't the environment that I wanted to be in. Like I remember going to labs in the University of Windsor, and like there'd be like a 10-minute break for after an hour, and like the people around me would be talking about like whatever they do at that games workshop store next to the movie theater in Devonshire Mall where they paint the little figurines,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and they
yeah.
like, and I was like, what is happening? I don't understand. So I just sat there by myself, like, and I don't know, I was fairly, I think I was like fairly extroverted. Like my job was always in some capacity, whether working at a gym or working downtown, I was always like interacting with people. And then I was like kind of the odd man out in the program because like I just liked history, but I also liked lifting weights. And it was to the point where the subject matter was really interesting and I enjoyed the course curriculum, but I couldn't get on board with this being my group of peers for the rest of my life, like this being my colleagues, and pursuing that at like a postgraduate level and like a doctoral level. Like just the idea of not having any shared interest outside of that was really odd to me. So then I just switched majors into kinesiology and moved up to Toronto with kind of the focus then as I made that transition of going from um, you know I was getting into kinesiology with the goal of getting into chiropractic college afterwards. So, 2 years later, I got accepted to Palmer West in San Francisco, California. And I was just like, all right, well, I guess I'm just going to go live there. And I just packed up and started school. So I moved out there September 17th, 2011, maybe 2011. And that was kind of it. October 1st, I started my first day of class, and I just kept my head down for 4 years, and on the other end of it, I have this little piece of paper and kind of a license to do whatever. And yeah, it was a complete 180 from where I started, like from sitting in whatever Letty Library or whatever the hell it's called at University of Windsor. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, yeah.
And then just being in California with the graduating however many 8 years after that. But I couldn't do anything else.
Yeah, I mean, so it takes time to find your where you want to go or how you're going to get there, kind of thing too, right? Like how do you decide like right out of high school that you want to do that, right? Or that you're sure that that's what you want. You know, it's hard for kids to make that decision and it takes time.
Yeah, I think it takes figuring out what you don't want to do too, right?
Yeah.
Like in the same way, like a whale or a bat might find its way around. It's like I'm gonna throw a bunch of stuff at some walls and see what comes back. And that's I more or less ended up here, not necessarily by like, especially now, like I have like a fairly obscure job day to day. I think for someone who's like technically a chiropractor, but um, it was basically what I do today is a direct consequence of all the things I didn't want to do before, and now I have the freedom to not do those things. So I'm just left with like what I like, concentrate. That's where I'm at right now. Every day it's just like stuff I like to do, concentrated, and trying to get rid of all the other stuff I don't like to do.
Yeah, I mean, you've been able to create yourself a great life and do a lot through, learning and teaching there yet as a coach as well too, right? So, I mean, that's one thing I wanted to talk about was being able to travel and just being able to go to school alone in California, and then, I mean, fast forward a little bit to now as well, like throughout all the people that you've probably trained and are going around supporting throughout the world. A privilege to all of this is being able to see the world, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And that's why, like, I was never like a great student by any stretch of the imagination. It's always funny to me that like people will, like, what does he do? Oh, he's in education, or oh, like he teaches. Like, wait, me? Jokingly, like, I spent most of grad school playing 9-ball pool in the break room. Like,
Yeah.
I could teach you how to do like a 3-rail bank shot or something, but teach, what the fuck am I doing teaching? But I think it was ultimately like, I saw what learning could do to, like someone's lifestyle. I was like, well, fuck, if I could just teach people this stuff, and I could put a barbell in their hands and I could put a clipboard in the other hand or whatever, and they could see all the stuff that I get to see because they know some stuff. It's like, well, yeah, like, hey, yo, this is how stuff works. Go use this and go get out and see the world. So yeah, it's still not real to me. Like, it'll never, like, you go to Windsor, it's like maybe once a year you go to Florida, or like, you scratch some cash together and you go to Mexico with your buddies or something, or
Yeah.
like maybe it's not even that, maybe you go to like Sauble Beach or
Yeah.
Grand Bend,
Grand
right?
Bad,
It's just
yeah.
like, yeah. So it's like, it's still wild. Like, I just got back from the Middle East, and it's like, it's not lost on me like how crazy it is that I just talk about lifting weights, and I lift some weights, and I write some stuff down
Yeah.
about lifting weights, and then I'm in Dubai, or I'm in uh going to Saudi Arabia or Australia or whatever. It's insane. It's completely insane.
Yeah, man. I mean, again, you've done what a lot of people, what everyone should do, and make their passion their work, right? And make it that way. You don't have a job, like you said. You don't really call yourself like a day-to-day job kind of thing, and that's your passion and teaching people how to do this kind of thing. But you have experience as well, like we talked about in competition. So let's kind of go through what you've done competition wise for powerlifting, like you said back 2016, and I found like a little history on all the things you've done. So a good like I think until 2019, maybe the pandemic stopped things, and we'll get into that. But tell me about like the competitions that you've been able to do.
Yeah, so my first meet was in Santa Cruz, as mentioned. It's called the Surf City Open. So I competed most of my powerlifting career up till now at 110 kilos, so like 242 pounds, which means like a bit of a weight cut. Like, I'm usually a bit heavier than that. I walked into this first meet with zero expectations, and like kind of thought if I had any expectations, I was going to get my ass handed to me, because all my training partners every day were just, orders of magnitude stronger. But meet went really well. I remember it was Father's Day, so it would have been like what, June 18th or something like that was the first meet I did, and I won best male lifter, best overall lifter, and I won my weight class, which was like, that was just crazy to me. To like, I didn't know how it worked. Like, I was just like, okay, I did my last deadlift. I'm just gonna like pack up and go home after being here for like 10 hours. And then they're like, wait, like, what about awards? I'm like, you guys give it awards for this? Are you joking? Like, what? So sure enough, like the first meet I did, I was like, oh, and like I started to see like what the other like amateur numbers were in my weight class. I was like, oh, like, okay, like I guess, it's almost like the Roger Bannister effect. Like, I go in every day and I see the equivalent of people running 4-minute miles. And I think my 5 minute mile is slow, relatively speaking. And then, you go with the rest of the population who's kind of amateur in the way they approach their training, and they just do it as a hobby. So I kind of, that paired with like putting content on social media, sort of melding my worlds together of like rehabilitation, chiropractic, sports performance, and then more specifically like powerlifting. I was able to compete. I think my next meet was Reebok Record Breakers, if I'm not mistaken. And it would have been November 2000, like maybe November of that year. I competed again, which was like a pretty big meet. And the head judge for my squats was like the greatest powerlifter of all time, this dude named Ed Cohn, who's now like a really close personal friend of mine. And was just able to kind of ascend and put together some pretty good training cycles. And I think my third meet was the Arnold Classic the following March in Australia, Pro Raw 9. And I was able to, I think I got third at that meet. Which was crazy. Like I just picked this thing up as a hobby, and I was flying to Australia to compete. And like, I did a few seminars, and I was actually able to make some money, which was wild. And that was the biggest catalyst in my career. Like a friend of Dan, Dan Green, who I was training with at the time, I had met years prior, and he'd come over from Australia to compete, and he had issues with his quads always cramping up when he was squatting. And I was still in like the clinical portion of school when I first met this guy, and I was just there to help Dan. And Dan was like, "Oh, could you help this guy out?" And he's like, this little, his name's Emad Nayef. And I didn't know, I was like stoked that someone would trust me enough to try and help him out on the day of a meet. And I helped him, and he was able to get through for the first time and not have his quads like cramp up, and he completed a meet. He was really excited. And 3 years later, I get a message, and he's the guy who coordinates Pro Raw, this meet at the Arnold Classic. And he's like, "Hey, like, you don't remember me, but this is what you did. Like, I see you're getting started in powerlifting, and I watch your stuff on social media, and you did this for me so many years ago. Like, I'd like you to come out and host a seminar and compete at the meet." So I was completely like blown away, and that's really what catalyzed like the career path I'm on now. And like teaching was like, I had this opportunity. I'd never done a seminar before, and it was kind of just dropped in my lap as like almost like a reciprocation to show a good faith. And I went out there and I competed, I did well, and I got invited back the following year, and then I got sponsored some point in that year, and I did Record Breakers again the following year, and it did quite well. And I think that was actually my biggest total. I think Record Breakers 2017, I totaled 1901 at 242. So I squatted 704, pulled 755, and bench 441 at 242. And that was like a big catalyst. And yeah, with COVID kind of taking everything sort of to its knees, haven't been competitive since June 2019, maybe 2018, 2019. And then really the seminar thing sort of took over, and the education thing started, and the business took off from there. And I took off with it. Literally been living mostly out of a suitcase for the better part of 3 years now. Yeah. Traveled all the way through COVID. Only recently, probably 6 months ago, maybe almost a year ago now, to have a residence in Canada. But I'm always just on the road. If there's ever someone who's like, "Hey, we want to hear you talk about lifting weights," it's like, I'm there.
Just need a place to stay. That's all.
That's how it started, man. Like I was living in San Francisco, and I was living out of my car. And for 2 months or 2 weeks out of every month, I was able to like find someone who would basically pay for me to fly in wherever they were. And the only thing I charged them was like my room and board. It was like, cool, I don't have to sleep in my Toyota 4Runner for this weekend. And then I would go back, and I would.
That's how they all start. That's how it's got to start somewhere, right? That's where all the great.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, it's part of the fun too, to be like, remember back when we had to do that? Look at me now, right?
Yeah.
And so like I don't know, would you think maybe you'll get back into competing, or is just the last couple, because it's kind of new, it's only been a couple of years that you've been kind of doing the whole thing, so just seeing enough success and kind of good with yourself right now, or hey, you never know, right?
Yeah, we'll see. It's definitely tough. The job demands a lot of travel of me, and it's not a lifestyle, if you're going to be really competitive at it, that lends itself to living on airplanes and missing training sessions and being short on sleep. So I definitely enjoy the competitive nature that comes with business development and entrepreneurship. and that's kind of been what's fulfilling that identity, fulfilling that competitive outlet or vehicle. So I've taken to developing, a handful of companies over the last couple of years, and at different levels of, incubation and maintenance and growth and all that. So lots to learn on that end. Powerlifting is always something, and training is always something that, it's part of like day-to-day life, and the platform will always be there. No immediate plans to compete. But I think the competition for me is like a day-to-day, on the business side. Like, I don't have a formal business background by any stretch of the imagination. I was just like kind of good at talking about lifting weights, maybe. Is that what I do? And now all of a sudden, I have a staff of 20, 25 people around the world, and another business that I'm getting off the ground. And it's so have enough challenges before I try and go full blow and back into powerlifting. So it'll be there. It's always going to be a part of how I train, but the real platform for me right now is on the business side.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that too. I mean, just doing research and looking you up, like, you're all over the place. There's all this different kinds of shit that comes up. So, I mean, you kind of mentioned it too, like you just started kind of putting stuff online. Is that how kind of the muscle doc persona kind of came to be?
Yeah, I never had a social media account before, like the Muscle Doc Instagram. Like, I had a Facebook and a MySpace page when I was living in Riverside, so however many years ago. But the Muscle Doc started with, I don't think I ever could have imagined that this would be like where it ended up, but it was meant to be something to bring education, or what I thought the market needed from an education standpoint, in resistance training and rehabilitation sports performance. So it was always geared towards being a vehicle for distributing information. And just, it's morphed into a podcast, it's morphed into a YouTube channel, it's morphed into basically an entire company that's the entire purpose of it. So the Muscle Doc YouTube started I want to say I had 2 or 3 semesters left of school, and I was just I was working with people in the fitness industry, working out with people in the fitness industry, was able to watch how they were monetizing the attention that their page got, and thought it to be like a really interesting sort of new frontier. And there are a handful of people in my industry, like the more like rehabilitative physiotherapy, physical therapy, chiropractic route, that were doing it. So I thought, why not, to put some skin in the game? And I just started the page and started posting, very poorly produced, shitty audio whiteboard videos of me talking fast, trying to fit it all in 60 seconds on Instagram, and then evolved to YouTube, and then longer form into podcast. And it's just sort of snowballed from there.
Yeah, man, it might be hard for people to understand, and even if you can't find all the content right away, I get it. I get it. Just like, you got the podcast over here. You can make a living alone on YouTube nowadays, but you got everything going on at once. And Prescript, if like I was like gonna just let you just kind of educate me on it, tell me about it, and look, but it's like you can get certified through you online, right?
Yeah, so Prescript is a continuing education company that's centered around like the health and fitness industry. So we offer 7 different courses that cover different subdisciplines around health and fitness, like with our core curriculum being our level 1, level 2 track. And then we have some ancillary courses that are more specific to different domains within weightlifting and resistance training and rehabilitation, sports performance. So it's really started off as a single course. Like, I kept getting posed the question, like, if you could take one class, or if you could learn one thing to be a successful coach or trainer or physical therapist, like, what would it be? I was like, there's a market here, right? Like, there's at least a market of one. Like, every day I was getting this question. So I took the question a little bit more seriously and made quite an expansive answer. And I put the course for sale without it even being complete. And I started to just gauge the audience of the first cohort, and have continuously polished the content of the Prescript level 1 ever since. Like, I teach it live. So I just really, like, literally just before this, I was teaching one of our lectures. And you're able to read the audience. You can see faces rather than just pre-recording it and having this content just exist uh, just kind of forever and without being updated and refreshed, or like without being able to be delivered in a way where it's being grasped. So um, the level one, the level two, I teach live still, so I can continuously turn over the content, semester over semester. And then we have some pre-recorded options. We have some hybrid courses that are pre-recorded content and lecture material. So it's been fun, man. Like, again, I never thought I'd find myself in the education space, but it's been like a huge challenge, both from like, you know, being able to deliver content, but also understanding like how people learn is a whole nother element of teaching that can sometimes be taken for granted. So like, studying, I spent a decade or more studying the content that I teach, but now, I feel like for the next 5 decades, it'll actually be learning how to teach, right? So it's something that I kind of take the pedagogy behind actually delivering the content in a way that's effective, because it is, it's not easy. Like, it's difficult.
No.
It's trying to synthesize 15 years of education and 15 years of experience into 16 weeks and make it palatable and more importantly for the trade that we're in, actionable, right? Like, my goal is ultimately not necessarily the coach or the trainer or the physical therapist, it's the people they interact with. And like, I can fill people's heads with big words and lots of syllables, and I can talk really fast about stuff that I like to think I know backwards, but that's not good. It's a cool parlor trick, but it's not useful if they don't know how to actually impart that knowledge. It's like philosophy in a sense, because it doesn't actually exist in theory. It only exists in practice. So it's an interesting uh, divergence of theory and practical application, because it's taught all in a more or less hands-off setting, but you need to teach it in a way that prompts real life action for what you say to be useful. So it's a constant challenge, but it's probably the most fun part of it is that piece.
It's cool, man. That's really cool. I mean, it's 2021 too, right? So people are learning all over the place and differently than ever. And you've created a great business to provide this, and not just like mass produce it and send it out, but to actually get that direct kind of one-on-one learning as well. It being live is kind of what I'm getting at, like it's not just like you can just watch anything on my YouTube, or you can buy my package. You can actually ask me questions, and again, that plays into like the teaching aspect of it. I always relate teaching and coaching together, and again, something that you love and have so much experience and knowledge on, dating all the way back to your Windsor days as just a kid, and then being a good life trainer or whatever. I mean, so much goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, because it's skin in the game, right? Like, if I pre-recorded it and edited, and if I misspoke, or I didn't recall something or I didn't have an analogy or a parable or an anecdote, it's like you're really trying to teach by, like, as an exemplar, right? Like, when you're with a client, or when you're with a patient, or you're with an athlete, like, there's no better sign of competency than being able to think on your feet, like being adaptable. So it's like shit goes wrong all the time when I teach,
Yeah.
all the time. I was teaching from my laptop in Australia during COVID, when I was locked down during like the forest fires. And I'd set my times originally based off Eastern Standard Time. So I would have to teach from 2:30 to 3:30 in the morning when I was in Australia. And halfway through a lecture, a bunch of cockroaches started crawling across my screen. I was like, I saw the rest of the lecture fucking sitting up in my
Yeah.
chair like this, because I fucking hate cockroaches. And like, I was in Kauai once, and the internet to the entire island got cut because it's served by a fiber optic cable that runs from Oahu. I was in a McDonald's in Sunny Isles, Florida, and a crackhead started shaking me down for money while I was teaching in the back corner. They call it the Mick lecture, and it's one of like the synonymous moments in our company's history. Like, our level two coaches that were there, this is like, I was driving to an office that I was using in Weston, Florida, when I was down there working with a bunch of NFL athletes in the off season. There was a crazy accident that put an hour delay on my drive. I wasn't going to make it to the office. I needed to pivot and find a solution, but it's like, pivoting and finding solutions is what coaching is, right? So it's as equal, and I've had this explained to me, like, it's equally as beneficial to be able to learn the content of how to pivot and transition and scale and index and progress and regress and adapt and optimize exercise, as it is to see someone do it in a lateral way and just delivering the content itself, right? So it's like, I got to be engaged with 50 blank faces or 100 blank faces or 200 blank faces. Well, I literally have a guy with gold teeth and like a Beretta in his waistband in my face next to me. Like, I have these headphones on. I have to be here, take my headphones off, and talk this guy down, and still flip through slides. And so it's fun like that, because there's a meta lesson there that keeps me engaged. If I just recorded it, put it up on the internet, like I wouldn't stay sharp. I wouldn't see the different facial reactions. I wouldn't learn. Right. Like I learned so much from doing it, because it's like I need to rethink my thought process, because I'm out in open field. Like I'm exposing what I think works and what I know to be effective
Yeah,
to
true.
criticism. Like, and it's what we have now is polished, it's ironclad, it's war ready. Like you can try and sink these theories, because thousands of people have sat there and appraised it critically, going like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So it's fun. And there are things where you just gotta, take ideas and completely torch them, and have a phoenix moment of a new idea rising from that. But I tell everyone every single semester that I just do this because I learn more than they do. So it's
Yeah.
like, thanks. And there it's a joke, but I don't know if it is, because I get a collective wisdom of thousands of coaches a year that I get to interact with.
Yeah. I mean, you're always learning, right? Like you don't stop learning. So you're going to be learning from your students as you're teaching, right? And
Yeah.
some crazy stories, but obviously, like you said, some fun times throughout short career and yet long career in life, but before we begin to wrap it up, you talked about working with some NFL players in the off season. I seen you got to work with Shaq. I'm sure you got to work with a lot of cool people, and maybe people that you've never heard of, or people that you're maybe in awe of.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had a crazy roster of clients. Um, but I think you just start to realize that everyone has a crazy story. Like some of them are my favorite clients. Like obviously, like Shaq and the football players, and like I could tell you stories about NFL players that bet 150. I had one client, I'm not going to name his name. He just won a Super Bowl ring last year, so that should help narrow it down. I
Mhm.
went to his place. He flew me in to work with him, and he was 45 minutes late, but I was in his house, and he was in his house. I was like, dude, what the fuck? Like, how are you? I'm billing you for this shit. And he didn't care, because he just won $150,000 playing a video game against a very famous rapper on a 2-on-2 game that he had recruited the top Call of Duty player in the world over Twitter, paid this guy 10 grand to play with him, to play a 2-on-2 game versus this famous rapper for $150,000. So he was completing that 2-on-2 game while I was upstairs, and he came up $140,000, which doesn't mean anything, because he makes 17 million plus, I
Yeah.
think $17 million a year. But it's like shit like that is cool. But then also, like, I've had clients when I was in the Silicon Valley that were, that one of my favorite clients is the head cardiothoracic surgeon at Stanford University. He's a guy from Toronto who, he would come in after doing, these surgeries that are so long that he's worn a diaper for a day and probably like 27 hours while he's, removing lungs and spleens and livers and just rerouting blood vessels. So it's like you get all sorts, right? Like fitness touches it touches everyone to a certain degree. And like, a lot of people will sit at the same table and bring their stories to me. It's like and it's funny because I'm looking at a picture of him right now. Like I think of Parts Unknown by Anthony Bourdain. Like I think of how food is like that. Like it's such a common experience. Like I find training to be the same thing. Like, so you'll hear some of the craziest fucking stories. One of my coaches that I work with that at Prescript, he was before he got into fitness, he was a anti-rhino. He was part of the anti-rhino poaching unit in Ghana, and he was an international arms dealer. So he would hunt people that were hunting rhinoceros, and he got shot close range with a 9mm in the chest. And I learned that in between sets, right? So it's just, I don't know, like if
Like, yeah, like the
everywhere you
small
look,
talk
there's
you
something.
have in the gym isn't the same that you guys.
But it's everywhere, man. Like even Windsor, when I was, you'd hear crazy ass stories of like, you know, yeah, I used to train guys in Hell's Angels, and it's like,
Yeah, true.
there's restaurants. You're like, really? That restaurant's like, yeah, dude. Like, just
Yeah,
drive
yeah.
by at 2 a.m. in the morning. There's a bunch of fucking black Mercedes in the parking lot, and so it's just, it's a disarming place where people can just they go there and they feel safe, and
Yeah.
they'll tell you anything. Any trainer, any coach will be like, I'm just a therapist. So it's amazing like what you can learn about other people when it's just in between sets, whether
Yeah.
it's, that cardiothoracic surgeon or some guy with a Harley Davidson and like a bunch of drugs in a hockey bag or some shit. Like
Yeah.
it's fun, man.
Yeah. And I mean, to bring it back to the Windsor part of it too, I mean, as many of the people that we have here, the stories that we have, there's also people coming here and creating stories and stuff like that, kind of like you're talking about as well. And as we get, I hate to wrap it up, but as we begin to wrap it up, I was going to ask you, what's the one thing you miss most about Windsor, and why is it Windsor pizza?
What do I miss most about Windsor? I think it's just the people, man.
Yeah,
Like
family.
it's it in its essence, it never changes, which can be good or bad. And like, there's always a divide of people who hate and love Windsor, and I feel like the
Yeah.
divide is those who left and those who stayed.
Yeah.
Right? The second you leave, you realize what you have. I think is probably the best way to put it. Where if you stay, you don't know how good you got it. Like, the inner, I never felt, no matter how, and like, work downtown, there's guns, there's drugs, there's whatever. I never felt in danger, right? I never felt like I could do anything wrong, because it's like, the cops, and you like, if you, as long as you acted reasonable, they'd act reasonable. And there's an unwritten, it seems to me as if there's like an unwritten code in Windsor where it's like there's just a set of rules and principles and values that if you abide by, it's like you could have a really good life. And I just don't think you'll find that anywhere else, where it's like a lot of times that there's, not that it's by any chance, like any stretch of the imagination, a fairy tale, but it's like, good seems to conquer in Windsor to a certain degree. Like, you keep your nose clean, you get your homework done, you go to work, and you're honest and you work hard, and like it just kind of works out. And in other places that's not the case. Like, you can go to cities and you can approach it with that that value set, and the city can spit you up and kick you out. Where it's like in Windsor, it'll always reward that. It seems like it
Yeah.
always seems like it lends a hand to those people who are like, punching the clock, which is something that like you don't find everywhere else. And if you go too long without seeing it, it gets a little bit like disheartening. But when you go home, it's always there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny you say that because, like you said, well, everyone says they hate Windsor, can't wait to leave, and they don't leave. you know, but it's like back at the beginning when we were talking, we were just talking about the craziness of working downtown and stuff that's happened, and if and it's very true. But now you say like you've always felt safe in Windsor. It's 100%. Like I see what you're saying, because again, to go back, I was gonna say, you could have movies, TV shows like set or based on Windsor, and like people should really, like people from outside of Windsor will be like, this is nuts. But people in Windsor won't really buy it because they're like, this ain't so bad. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And that's just, I guess it's just it. But I didn't really realize it now, kind of coming all full circle in this conversation, at least.
Yeah, and it just comes down to the people, man. Like, I remember I was in a jam outside. I worked at the bar or the door at Treehouse.
Yeah.
I was like, I'll still go home. Like, oh, that's the Treehouse guy. Like, I haven't worked at Treehouse in like 13 years. And I remember, like, there was some pretty bad shit happening. And I went to grade school with like, and I don't know where he's at, and if he's ever listens or anyone knows, I mean, it's Windsor, because you probably do. There was a kid, he was older than me. There was a dude named Terry Malden, who I knew from grade school, who, him and his brother Kevin, I think he had a younger sister, like Terry, for better or for worse, like he took care of business and whatever that means. And I was outnumbered and outgunned, and Terry just remembered me from MS Hetherington, and he just took care of things for me. Like, I was cornered by a bunch of people until Terry was like, wait a minute, I know this guy. I don't know these other guys, but I know that kid. We went to grade school together, and he grabbed 3 or 4 guys in his friend group, let's call it, to be diplomatic, and they just came in. And I was at the fireworks one time, and had a beef with some kids from another high school, and some guys who knew me from playing hockey. Like, I was again cornered and outnumbered and outgunned. The next thing I look over my shoulder, and it's my mom's friend's son and his friends, and one of them had procured a shovel, I was like, don't worry, we got it. And so it's just like you always just know like this Windsor hero is just gonna come out of like the woodwork. It's like I don't think I was ever like, work downtown, people are drunk, you get in situations as like the
Yeah.
sober bouncer, you're obviously a target. You're walking down by the river, someone wants to start some shit and jump you or whatever. And like, I think as long as you had like you kept your nose clean, like as crazy as it got sometimes, you always just had this feeling like something like you were gonna be okay. And then sure enough, like there's a guy with a shovel, and there's Terry with four guys, right? Like with four bottles from inside the club. It's like they're just gonna take care of it for you. So I don't know, it's
No,
funny because
man.
like
Yeah.
you look back, I remember what fuck, I hate to go on, but I literally could do this all day. I
Yeah.
remember driving down Droulard Road, 3 a.m. in the morning after the bars. I was driving my buddy home, and we pull up. It was like in between. It was the bad part of Droulard, like between Droulard at Tecumseh Road and Wyandotte, at some point in that strip. And there was a guy at one of the stop signs walking across the street with a chainsaw that was on. No shirt on, jeans, straight out of like an Eminem early LP. And I was like, what the? And he looked in like the window of my like whatever the 98 Sebring convertible. And me and my buddy were just sitting there going like, I wonder who he's looking for. And like he looked in and like realized that whoever was in the car wasn't who was meant to be on the other end of the and he like tipped his chainsaw, like he kind of like revved it a bit, like, oh, have a good day, sir, like as you were, and just continued off into the fucking chain link fences. I was like, oh, okay. And it wasn't until years later I'm like, that was kind of fucked up. Like that was
Yeah.
but I never felt like, like, oh shit, what do we do? Do I reverse it? Like he's gonna chase us, he's gonna jump on the car. I'm like, I wonder what he's looking for. I wonder what drives someone to like get a chainsaw to like get their point across. Huh. And then like he's just like looked, oh, okay, have a good night, fellas, and just kept going. I was like, this is it. This is Windsor.
True,
I
Lord,
have
baby.
literally a million stories like that.
That's crazy, first off, but it might sound stupid to people, but at least like the backing each other up kind of shit is like what we were raised on around here, I think, at least. And like we always talk about it on the show, but this is the first time it's really like came out in kind of layman's terms, and at least to me it makes sense. So I'm sure other people listening around here will, maybe not the Toronto people, but man, that we could do this all day. I mean, maybe we'll have to do another one, just talk about
Yeah.
Windsor. We got your story down. We were able to tell your story here on WinCity Sports. So I appreciate you taking the time to do it, man. You're a busy guy, I'm sure. So thanks so
I
much.
appreciate you putting this together, man. It's cool to have a collective of like the voices that came out because I think it is a unique place. It's a unique place for some, just for this very reason that two people will look at that and be like, no, it's a story. It's stories worth telling, right? Because a lot of times I think we get discarded, pushed aside, just like it's Toronto, it's not Toronto, it's not London, it's not Montreal or
Yeah,
Ottawa, but
yeah.
it's like, yeah, but we have our own. There's a romanticization of Windsor that I think is very unique, if for no other reason that people are willing enough to recognize it to do something like this.